Hello everybody, Dean Dwyer from Isaac Street Baptist Church with you for another video in our Prison of the Isms series. Now if you're joining us for the first time, this is actually number 5 in the video series. We began by introducing the series in our first video. What is the Prison of the Isms and why is it a danger to the world? And then what we're going to do throughout this series is go from the 1920s right up to the 2020s, examining 100 years of Marxism, Socialism and Communism in order to see and lay out, using the evidence, as to why this is such a dangerous ideology for the world. So we started with the introductory video, we then moved to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and now we're in the 1950s. So it's good to have your company, and although you're welcome to watch this as a standalone video, you will get the most out of the series if you do start from the beginning. Now, before we go on with the video today, I just want to publicly thank my partner in this series. His name is Rod. Now, you won't see Rod in front of the camera, but his work behind it is invaluable. So thanks to Rod. I want to begin by revisiting the Frankfurt School because it played such an important part in the growth of Marxism in the world today. And basically, the Frankfurt School believed that as long as an individual had the belief, or even the hope of a belief, that his divine gift of reason could solve the problems facing society, then that society would never reach the state of hopelessness and alienation that they considered necessary to provoke socialist revolution. Now, you heard that right. The belief is that they don't want people to have hope. They don't want you to have hope. They want you to have hopelessness so that all of the people rise up in revolution. But what is the one obstacle in their way? Christians know it. It is Christianity. Because the Bible declares that Jesus Christ is our blessed hope. We will always have hope because we have Him. So what was their first task? They needed to undermine as swiftly as possible the Judeo-Christian legacy. And to do this, they called for the most negative, destructive criticism possible of every sphere of life, which would then be designed and constructed to destabilize and bring down what they saw as the oppressive order. Now, this was a war, and they fought it as a war, not with bullets, but with ideology. And because of the way that this war was fought, a nation that could therefore die on its own soil, without resettlement, without invasion, but simply by stoking these flies of decomposition to corrupt the nation, to bring down its principles in order that they may introduce their own. We talk very much about the problem of a virus in our day. Well, they wanted their policies to spread like a virus as well, unseen and unstoppable. And so to further their advance of their so-called quiet cultural revolution, but giving no ideas about what their future plans had in store for the world, the Frankfurt School had recommended, amongst other things, these core principles. Number 1, the creation of racism offences. Continual change to create confusion. The teaching of sex and homosexuality to children. Encouraging the breakdown of the family. The undermining of schools and teachers' authority. Huge immigration to destroy identity. Dependency on the state or state benefits. An unreliable legal system with a bias against victims of crime. The ridicule of fellow man. The emptying of churches. The control and dumbing down of media. And the theory that if you push a negative hard enough, it will push through to become a positive. Now, if you think on how your society operates, based on the above list, you will find that most, if not all, of these principles have already been implemented, much without the knowledge of every citizen. People may claim it's progressivism. It's not. It's simply communism under a different name. Lord Bertrand Russell died in 1970, but prior to his death, he was a British academic with an interest in philosophy, logic and mathematics. He had joined the Frankfurt School in their effort at social engineering, And he spilled the beans on their work in his 1951 book entitled The Impact of Science on Society. And in that book he wrote the following: "Physiology and psychology afford fields for scientific technique which still await development. However, the importance of mass psychology has been increased enormously by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon arise. First, that the influence of the home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a distinctly morbid taste for eccentricity. But I anticipate. It is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and to discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is dark grey. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen." End quote. I don't know if many people realise it, but Frankfurt School doctrines now completely dominate the universities, teaching students to replace reason with politically correct ritualistic exercises. There are very few theoretical books on arts, letters or language published in the United States or Europe today which do not openly acknowledge their debt to the Frankfurt School. The witch hunt on today's campuses is merely the implementation of what we know as repressive toleration. That is, they tolerate policies from the left, but they don't tolerate policies from the right. We joke about political correctness, and it's an ongoing annoyance to all of us in society today, but it's deadly serious in its aims because it seeks to impose on all uniformity of thought and uniformity of behaviour. It is therefore totalitarian in nature because its intent is to intimidate dissenters into compliance with their accepted dogma. I think the reason that people joke about political correctness is due to the fact that they don't know how to handle it. They don't know whether or not to take it seriously. But may I submit to you that losing freedom of religion, freedom of speech, property rights and parental authority is no laughing matter whatsoever. Thought control is not funny. Many Christians have been prosecuted under hate crime laws for sharing the gospel and for publicly speaking out against what the Bible refers to sin and abomination. You see, the goal of neo-Marxism is to destroy Christianity in all areas of life. Why? We touched on it before. The elimination of the Christian worldview will create the chaos necessary for Marxism to reign supreme. Once chaos has reached a fevered pitch, the public will cry out to the government to solve the problem, but they will seal not their salvation, but their enslavement. Dr. Timothy Leary gave us another glimpse into the mind of the Frankfurt School in his account of the work of the Harvard University psychedelic drug project entitled Flashback. He quoted a conversation that he had with Aldous Huxley, and I quote, "These brain drugs, mass-produced in the laboratories, will bring about vast changes in society. It will happen with or without you or me. All we need to do is spread the word. The obstacle to this evolution is the Bible. We've run up against the Judeo-Christian commitment to one God, one religion, one reality that has cursed Europe for centuries and America since our founding days. We believe that the time for a new humanist religion based on intelligence, good-natured pluralism and scientific paganism has come. Drugs that open the mind to multiple realities inevitably lead to a polytheistic view of the universe." End quote. Well, although operating in the US for a time after World War II, the core operation of the Frankfurt School moved back to the University of Frankfurt. And the Institute of Social Research continued, but what was the Frankfurt School did not. Yet the damage was already done in America. The neo-Marxism that has since taken hold of schools and universities, the political correctness which has destroyed the family bond, religious tradition and our entire culture all sprang from the Frankfurt School. Not many realise that it was these intellectual Marxists who, during the anti-Vietnam demonstrations, coined the phrase "make love, not war," and they were responsible for all the negative criticism promoted along with it. They dreamed of a utopia where their rules governed, and it was their concept that led to the current fad for rewriting history in order to suit their agenda. You know, during the 1950s in America, Americans were arguably known to be the best in everything. They were the envy of the world, including the communist and Bolshevik world. But they hated America. They hated it because of the three principles it stood for: truth, justice, Christianity. That is why communist ideologues worked so hard to subvert and undermine American institutions. They couldn't defeat them head on, so they used critical theory as their weapon of choice. The Frankfurt School published a lot of material, but the first was their paper on critical theory. You'll hear a lot about critical race theory in the news today, but this was the genesis of the idea, and it was called critical theory. The premise was simple, and it's fully revealed in its title. Criticise every pillar of American culture: family, democracy, common law, freedom of speech. Criticise it at any and every opportunity. And it was hoped, under this sustained criticism, that the pillars of American culture would eventually crumble under the pressure. Whilst key players Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer returned to Germany when World War II ended, there's another guy instrumental in this movement called Herbert Marcuse, and he actually stayed in America. And in 1955, he published his book Eros and Civilization. And the book called for polymorphous perversity, which was a concept crafted by Freud. And it posed the idea of sexual pleasure outside the traditional norms. And unfortunately, it would become very influential in shaping the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And we'll talk more about this concept in the next video, because these ideas really did lead to the beginning of the sexual perversion that the world is bearing the fruit of today. Now, I mentioned the word communism to people, and during that time in particular, they would turn their mind to Russia, and in particular the KGB. But at the time, the KGB was more concerned about the psychological warfare against the American government through ideological subversion rather than any espionage activities. In fact, they focused on brainwashing techniques. And they used this in order to infuse the American population with an ideology that was distinct from their own traditions and principles. And so effective are these techniques that manipulation of public opinion can make people reject obvious facts in favour of perception. And the Soviet Union used 4 methods to alter the mindset and behaviour of people in foreign countries. Now, I want you to keep in mind, these people are extremely patient. They don't expect results immediately. And in fact, the first step, which was demoralisation, took between 15 and 20 years to bear fruit. And so during this phase, young people were influenced to question the integrity of their country and raise suspicions through media propaganda and academia. What that does then is perception takes centre stage and facts simply become meaningless. And so for a population of self-absorbed people in a world of propaganda soaked in theories of Marxism and Leninism, truth loses its grip on society, leading many to seek their own truth, only to be demoralised when they can't find it. And so once that demoralisation begins, destabilisation, crisis and normalisation follow in short succession. In fact, the word normalisation is actually derived from Soviet propaganda, and this was used to explain away a drastic change in a country just simply as some type of organic phenomenon. Now, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device, and it ended therefore the United States' short reign as the sole atomic power on Earth. And the entry of the Soviets into the atomic club made the Americans very nervous. They also made them very suspicious. How on earth did the USSR get the bomb so quickly? When it came to light that Soviet spies in the US atomic program had passed secrets to Russia, Americans began to worry that spies might be lurking in every corner of society. And so in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there were several highly publicised espionage trials that convicted leading scientists and government officials of espionage. And this culminated in the 1953 execution of Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel for passing information about the atomic bomb to Russia. These convictions served to justify fears that spies could be active throughout the country, feeding into this decade-long paranoia from 1947 to 1957 that communists were simply everywhere in the US, and that led to this derogatory term of Reds under the bed. Now, in this atmosphere of distrust, a broad range of institutions rushed to root out suspected communists from within their ranks. And the US government in turn stepped up loyalty programs and purged itself of anyone deemed a security threat. And individuals believed to be particularly susceptible to bribery or blackmail, which, funnily enough at the time, were homosexuals and debtors that were the targets, they were summarily dismissed. Schools and universities also fired teachers who refused to swear an oath that they were not communists, and even civil rights organisations got in on the action, like the National Association for the Advancement of Colour People and another organisation called the Urban League. They moved quickly to rid themselves of suspected communists, lest they too be accused of subversion. Now, first formed in 1938, there was a group called the HUAC, and this was the House Committee on Un-American Activities. A strange name. But it was a special committee formed in the US House of Representatives, and it was tasked with investigating subversive individuals and organisations. And so in the 1950s, the HUAC turned its attention on hunting Reds, which was, as we know, a slang term for communists associated with the red flags of the USSR and China, and influenced by a pamphlet called Red Channels. Now, they had alleged that communists had infiltrated the entertainment industry and intended to use the suggestive power of the media to spread propaganda to American audiences. And so the HUAC began investigating Hollywood figures. They eventually charged 151 writers, actors and directors with having ties to the Communist Party. All of them were subsequently blacklisted, whether or not these charges were substantiated. And so from that, studios refused to hire anyone on the blacklist, fearing backlash from sponsors and audiences, and therefore destroying the careers of many talented entertainers. Politicians got in on the action as well and profited from this scare, notably Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy. Fearful that his weak record in the Senate would prevent his re-election, McCarthy looked for an issue that would shore up his image to voters. What do good politicians do, or devious ones at that? They look for issues of the day which are stoking fear in the community, and they latch onto them. So what better to latch on and seize than the issue of communism? And so at a meeting of Republican women in 1950, he brandished a sheath of papers and declared that he had in his hand a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, who nevertheless were supposedly still working behind the scenes forming policy in the State Department. McCarthy's allegations shocked the nation. So, suddenly finding himself in the spotlight, he held hearings in the Senate, relying on innuendo and hearsay to condemn members of the State Department of communist connections. And so McCarthy railed against supposed communists, Eastern establishment Democrats and homosexuals for more than 4 years. But during that time, he never produced any real evidence against anyone. And even though there were people around him who were powerful enough to stop him, they didn't, because they were fearful that he would instead simply turn the spotlight upon them. McCarthy finally went too far in 1954 when he initiated hearings against the US Army, and these were the televised Army McCarthy hearings. But all they did was really highlight his increasingly erratic behaviour and his reliance on guilt by association rather than any real evidence. And in December 1954, finally, the US Senate voted to censure him. and perhaps seen as evidence of his underlying problems, McCarthy died of medical complications from alcoholism less than 3 years later. But during the 1950s, the anti-communist hysteria spread like wildfire throughout the US. This was a hysteria which was less founded in the objective circumstances of the situation, but more so on a set of assumptions and fears of the unknown. But what it did create was an increasingly extreme political mood. When the Internal Security Act was passed by Congress in September 1950, even President Truman was shocked. But this was despite the fact that Truman himself had continued to stoke fears of infiltration into the US government by communist agents, and he had passed Executive Order 9835 in 1947, but he still saw the Internal Security Act as a step too far. He attempted to veto the bill because he drew explicit parallels between it and totalitarian government, writing that it would put the government of the United States in the thought control business. Now, other failed attempts to impinge on the most basic human rights came from the FBI. And in 2007, declassified documents revealed that J. Edgar Hoover, its longtime director, had a plan to suspend habeas corpus, which was a principle that allowed somebody who believes they'd been unlawfully detained to appeal to the court. Had his plan come to fruition, he would have had the power to imprison some 12,000 Americans he suspected of disloyalty. But this culture of extreme paranoia and anti-communist hysteria had a huge impact on American culture, notably in schools and the entertainment industry. In schools, children were shown educational programs on how to spot a communist. Elsewhere, science fiction films were often thinly veiled metaphors for the dangers of communist invasion, such as The Thing from Another World, produced in 1951, Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, and The Blob in 1958. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, the Communist Party of Great Britain became the largest communist party in the UK between 1920 and 1991. Founded in 1920 through a merger of several smaller Marxist parties, the CPGB gained the support of many socialist organisations and trade unions following the Russian October Revolution in 1917 and the political fallout from the First World War. And ideologically, the CPGB was a socialist party organised upon Marxist-Leninist ideology, meaning it was strongly opposed to British colonialism, sexual discrimination and racial segregation. And these beliefs led many leading anti-colonial revolutionaries, feminists and anti-fascist figures to become closely associated with the party, with many prominent CPG members becoming leaders of Britain's trade union movement. CPGB membership nearly tripled after the end of World War II, reaching the height of its popularity. And during the mass migration of British African Caribbean people, known as the Windrush generation, the CPGB dedicated much of its political activity to opposing British racial segregation, which inspired many black leading rights activists to join the party. And the most famous of these black activists was Claudia Jones, who created Britain's first major black newspaper and founded London's Notting Hill Carnival, which is the world's second largest annual carnival. In 1956, the party experienced a large loss of membership due to its support of Soviet military intervention in Hungary, and consequently it took the party almost a decade to recover its lost membership. In 1951, the party issued a program called the British Road to Socialism, officially adopted at the 22nd Congress in April 1952. And it explicitly advocated the possibility of a peaceful transition to socialism, but according to some historians, only after it had been personally approved by Stalin himself. And the death of Stalin in 1953 and the uprising in East Germany the same year had little direct influence on the CPGB, but they were indications of what was to come. Of more importance was Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in which he denounced Stalin. According to George Matthews, who was a British communist activist and newspaper editor, Khrushchev made a deal with the CPGB to provide a secret annual donation to the party of more than £100,000 in used notes. The Polish Poznan protests of 1956 disrupted not only the CPGB but many other communist parties as well, and consequently the CPGB was to experience its greatest ever loss of membership as a result of the Warsaw Pact's crushing of the Hungarian revolt, which saw the loss of between 1/4 and 1/3 of party members, including many of its leading intellectuals. And after the calamitous events of 1956, the CPGB increasingly functioned as a lobby group, seeking to use its well-organised base in the trade union movement to push the Labour Party leftwards. But while the UK and USA were experiencing an uptick in communist activity, things were actually changing in the USSR as well. And the death of Stalin on 5th of March 1953 allowed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, to proceed with the moderate liberalisation of the USSR, later known as de-Stalinisation. Afterwards, most European communist parties developed a reformist element. With the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance signed on 14 May 1955, the USSR established the Warsaw Pact with 7 countries of the Eastern Bloc. And the geopolitical principles of the Warsaw Pact Defence Treaty included respect for the independence and sovereignty of states and the practice of non-interference in their internal affairs. And on 15 May 1955, the day after the USSR established the Warsaw Pact, the Austrian State Treaty established Austria as a neutral country in the ensuing Cold War between the USA and the USSR. Now, in February 1956, as the first secretary of the CPSU, Nikita Khrushchev initiated the de-Stalinisation of the USSR with the speech on the personality cult and its consequences, which catalogued and denounced the abuses of power committed by Joseph Stalin and his inner circle proteges in Russia and abroad. And in the West, the CIA's radio network, Radio Free Europe, broadcast Khrushchev's anti-Stalin speech to the communist-controlled countries of Eastern Europe in an effort to destabilise the internal politics of the Warsaw Pact. Now, in the Cold War of the 1950s, the confrontational nature of the Russo-American relations allowed the US to secretly encourage the Warsaw Pact countries to escape Soviet dominance by their own efforts. And so to avoid a Russo-American nuclear war that could possibly result from overt political interference with the Warsaw Pact, the US secretly undermined the political authority and cultural influence of the USSR among Warsaw Pact countries, but stopping just short of regime change. When economic warfare, sabotage and psychological warfare failed to contain world communism, the US then resorted to diplomacy with the USSR. Yet, despite those failures of secret warfare, Vice President Richard Nixon encouraged the US National Security Council still to deploy the CIA to continually provoke the USSR into repressing an anti-communist revolt in Warsaw Pact countries, because heavy-handed Soviet repression would then provide anti-communist propaganda beneficial to the US's geopolitical interests. And on 24 October 1956, the Politburo of the USSR discussed options for resolving the political upheavals occurring in the Warsaw Pact countries, specifically the Polish and Hungarian revolts. And so, led by Foreign Minister Molotov, the hardline faction of the CPSU voted for military intervention, but were opposed by Khrushchev and Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov. But on the same day, US Secretary of State John Dulles suggested that the United Nations Security Council convene to discuss the USSR's invasion and occupation of the Hungarian People's Republic. However, it came without a decisive result, ironically, because of a dispute thousands of kilometres away. Because of the Anglo-French imperial intervention in Egyptian politics during the Suez Crisis, caused by Britain and France's seizure of the Suez Canal, US President Richard Nixon said that we couldn't, on the one hand, complain about the Soviets intervening in Hungary, and on the other hand, approve the British and French picking that particular time to intervene against Gamal Abdel Nasser. And so despite earlier demands for the rollback of communism and the liberation of Eastern Europe, Dulles told the USSR that we do not see these countries as potential military allies. Therefore, it became very clear that the Americans were not interested in building military alliances in Eastern Europe, but merely using these countries to provoke anti-communist sentiment and drive a wedge between them and the USSR. And so that was John Dulles's intention, but what John Dulles's brother did behind the scenes is very shocking. This was a case of espionage and personal revenge combining under a CIA operation known as Operation Splinter Factor. And while the Un-American Activities Committee and the FBI terrorised suspected communists and their alleged sympathisers in the US during the 1940s and 50s, the CIA was simultaneously helping to orchestrate a campaign of witch hunts and show trials against those accused of betraying Moscow in Soviet bloc countries. Enter a man known as Allen Dulles. He was director of the CIA from 1953 to 1961, and he was the brother of US Secretary of State John Dulles. Never before had two brothers occupied such powerful government positions, but Allen's job, quite simply, was to hijack the government for the benefit of the wealthy. In fact, many believe he was responsible for coordinating the assassination of JFK. Now, regarding his work in Eastern Europe, he had used his Eastern Bloc contacts to purge Eastern European communist parties of their moderate, nationalistic-minded leadership by using a Polish secret police double agent to name prominent liberal communists as CIA agents based on their cooperation with US intelligence during World War II in the struggle against Nazi Germany. So by 1951, some 169,000 Czech communists, which was about 10% of their membership, were arrested. Thousands more were arrested in Poland, East Germany and Bulgaria, leading to hundreds being executed and thousands dying in prison. Yet, almost all of those named were innocent of their charges. But worse was to come, and Dulles was involved again. Now, we know that Iran is a constant irritant to America and Israel at present, but one wonders if that would be the case had the CIA not turned their attention on Iran many decades ago. Between 1951 and 1953, Mohammad Mossadeg was the 35th Prime Minister of Iran, known as Persia at the time, but his government was overthrown by a coup instigated by MI6 and the CIA. Mossadeg at the time had enraged the Brits by nationalising the country's oil supply. And so under the Truman administration, America initially supported Mossadeg because he was staunchly anti-communist. But this soon changed once the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden offered the Americans a share in Iran's oil. So the coup was launched. But by this time, Truman was out of the White House and America was under the presidency of Eisenhower. Historians have yet to reach a consensus on why the Eisenhower administration opted to use covert action in Iran, tending to either emphasise America's fear of communism or its desire to control oil as the most important factor influencing the decision. In fact, there's an element of truth in both. The operation was not meant to prevent a communist coup, but to reverse conditions that might result in a communist government, while producing the conditions necessary to restart the flow of oil. But unfortunately, the coup laid the basis for the same clerical terror which is now being waged by the Khomeini regime today. And again, one wonders if the Americans and Brits had not interfered in Iran in the 1950s, would Iran have turned into the terrorist sponsoring state it now is? Not content with his work in Iran, Dulles set his sights on also launching a coup in Guatemala, again believing they were vulnerable to communist threat. And this intervention again led to destabilisation and a civil war which lasted from 1960 to 1996, killing 200,000 people and displacing around 1 million. Cuba was next. But although the tactic of deploying a band of terrorists upon Iranians and Guatemalans worked a treat for the Americans, their operation in Cuba, well, it was an abject failure. It led to the embarrassment of JFK and the sacking of Allen Dulles as CIA director. And it was this sacking and Dulles' belief that JFK was a threat to national security that many believe was a trigger for the planning of his assassination. Now, in closing, although I believe communism is definitely a danger to the world, the fact is that the Americans used their fight against communism as a pretext to terrorise and control country after country throughout the 50s and early 1960s. And though they saw their war and fight as virtuous, evidence confirms that it led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, billions of wasted dollars, probably trillions by this stage, and ongoing military and diplomatic tension with many of those countries that remains to this day. But although the CIA and US government were terrorising the citizens and governments of other nations, it was in the 1960s that they began to turn their attention on their own citizens. And this is going to form the basis of our next video when we examine the 1960s and how, during the 1960s, the attention of these social engineers was turned back upon the American people. We look forward to your company then.